Okay, welcome everybody. I think it's just gone past 6:30, so we should get going. Obviously the first item on the is filming at meetings. I believe this meeting is being filmed. Apologies for absence. I know of apologies from Councillor Bevan, and Councillor Carter is substituting for Councillor Engert, and
apologies from Councillor Newton.
And apologies from Councillor Newton.
Apologies from Bevan or Lakers?
Was it apologies from Councillor Bevan? Sorry, just to clarify, Councillor Bevan is going to try to be here, but he may be late. So we'll move on to item 3. Any items of urgent business? Not that I'm aware of. Item 4 is declarations of interest. None. Item 5, deputations, petitions and presentations. I'm not aware of any. And which takes us to item 6, which is, but before I do that, what I was going to do is, because we've got a new member of the committee, is if we all go round and introduce ourselves. So Councillor Carroll is a new member of our committee, so if we just introduce ourselves, that would be great. So my name is Councillor Amina Ibrahim. I'm the chair of this panel and Labour councillor for Haringey Ward.
Tina Brabazon, Councillor Haringey Ward.
Yeah, Councillor Carroll, Tottenham Hale Ward.
Councillor Anne Waters, Woodside Ward.
Clive Carter, Highgate Ward.
Chris Liffin, Interim Managing Director, Homes for Haringey.
Denise Gundy, Director, Housing Demand, Homes for Haringey.
Alan Benson, Head of Housing Strategy and Commissioning, London Borough of Haringey.
Rita Bacetta, Senior Business Partner, London Borough of Haringey.
I'm Christian Skade, Scrutiny Officer at Haringey Council.
Okay, our next item is the minutes. So if we go to the minutes, and if there are any... Councillor Carroll.
Yeah, Chair, sorry to take you up on minutes just in my first meeting. I want to draw attention to page 3. The panel raised a number of issues concerning service charges and asked whether these would be affordable to returning social housing tenants or whether any increases would effectively render the promise to return as meaningless. In order to provide clarity, Ms Garner agreed to provide the panel with a written response on these issues. I mean, to my mind, there was a fair bit of clarity actually in the answer that she gave. She said they would very probably go up.
Okay, so you're raising that as a matter arising or a correction?
A correction, because if you do turn to the scrutiny responses, which are the responses on these action points, and actually I think they're basically at the level of verbal replies, except they're written down, so it doesn't actually add more clarity. I would have, if you say you're going to give a written response, I would expect much more than that, but that's by the by. I think the response on number 3, again, reading between the lines, it very definitely goes up. You see, the service charges very definitely goes up. And the reason that is important to minute is because there's a claim of same situations and same conditions and all of these kind of things, and I think most people would consider that if their service charges were going to go up, and I've been in politics long enough to know that if someone says something's very probably going to happen and that thing is not a very good thing, it's going to happen, then I would suggest that most people would see that that is that's not the same condition. So I just want this panel to kind of like be clear about that, and I don't think the minutes in page 3 reflect the fact that the officer did say that they would very probably go up. That's my recollection. I don't. If anyone has a different one, I'm happy to. You know.
Okay, so are you suggesting that we amend the minutes to reflect that? Councillor Brabazon.
Is there something in the minutes? Again, it relates to this annex on page 9. As you know, Chair, I've asked several times about the member agreement, and I've asked that at the Cabinet, and I raised it at the last meeting, the member agreement between Haringey and Lend-Lease in regard to the HGV. And I've asked to receive a copy of the revised members' agreement. There isn't any reference to that in this update, so I don't know when we're going to be provided with that. Oh yes, it is. I beg your pardon. It's on item 7. But what I'm concerned about is that point 1, I don't know how we deal with this because it's a note in the minutes, but it seems to contradict what was said at the Cabinet. If you look at point 1, we've been page 9, scrutiny response. It says here, panel was informed the policy would be considered by Cabinet, it would take precedence over the HDV legal agreements. Now that is not what has been said at the Cabinet, to my recollection, and certainly when it was agreed that the member agreement took precedence, and that was agreed, I think, by Councillor Strickland. Yeah.
So that sounds to me not like a correction to the minutes, but a matter arising. So, yeah, so it's an issue that's not necessarily about the accuracy, but it's about, because I've got some matters arising from it as well. So what I recognise that it was a bit of a complex answer, but that what Councillor Carroll, are you saying that you want the minutes to be amended?
If I'm correct in that, and I believe I am, that she said the service charges would very probably go up. Since receiving these, I haven't gone and looked back at the thing, but that's what I think she said, or to that effect.
So I think how we resolve this issue is in the matters arising section, because I think we can only obviously go back and have a look at what was exactly said, because obviously there may be different understandings of it. So if we could, would it still be available on webcast, what was exactly said? We need to recognise is that minutes aren't verbatim. Yes. So obviously, but did you still feel that inaccurately reflects the? If it says something completely different to what was said, that's one issue. If it's not as specific as we would wish it to be, then that's more about whether the minutes are a broad reflection or verbatim minutes.
You're looking at the minutes and saying that what I'm saying is incorrect on the basis of the minutes. I'm agreeing with you. What my recollection is completely in contradiction to what is in the minutes, because what my recollection is that she said it is very probably going to go up. If I'm wrong about that, then I'm wrong about that. But that was my recollection. You know. It's not a question of verbatim, Chair. I recognise the difference between minutes and kind of a verbatim account of what's going on. It just struck my mind at the time that it was a pretty crucial development and revelation, and it pertains to a particular promise about the same conditions and blah blah blah. And I just don't see how anyone could see that was the case if someone's saying that the service charges are going up.
Christian's got a suggestion here. Would you like to?
Yeah. In the sentence before, in order to provide clarity, my suggestion would be along the lines of there was concerns raised that service charges could be increased.
But I think
my quibble on this is not the minutes about what concerns were raised. It's about the minutes of what the answer was. To my recollection, and I remember making a mental note of it at the time, and my group colleagues will confirm that I have a pretty good memory for this, that she said that they would very probably go up, or something very similar to that. It's the response I want minuted, not that concerns are raised. We've already got that in there. I think that's quite clear. In order to provide, and this is saying in order to provide clarity. And my point is that I think there was a fair bit of clarity that evening, actually. And on a lot of things, I'd let it fly.
Okay, what I'll do is I propose that we provisionally agree the minutes and then go back to the record of what exactly was said, and then that specific section, and I don't want to set a precedent for this because I don't like verbatim minutes, that for that specific section that we look at what exactly was said, and just for that item we record it verbatim and just put some quotation marks around it. But I just want to be clear, I don't want to set a precedent for verbatim minutes. Okay? Thank you. Are there any matters arising? Councillor Brabazon.
Well, if I ever get that on. Yeah, I'm going back to this issue about, it's on page 3 of the minutes, and yeah, it's
I've just been told that we don't do matters arising, even though I thought we would normally. Okay, so then we'll go back. So questions, go on, if you ask a general question.
If it's matters arising or minutes or whatever, the point I would like recorded and taken up, since we haven't got an officer here to respond, is it says here on page 3, paragraph 2, the panel was informed the policy would be considered by Cabinet in October 2017 and would take precedence over the HGV legal agreements. Now, to my certain recollection, because I've asked umpteen times at Cabinet, at least 3 times, about this member agreement, it was agreed, Chair, if you indulge me for a moment, that the member agreement was ambiguous, the current one that was published in the Cabinet about the HGV on July 3rd. That has been conceded, and this is now being redrafted. It has also been accepted at the Cabinet, as far as I know, and that I heard, that the member agreement was the predominant document. But this says the reverse. So we need clarity, is really important, because the Cabinet is claiming, and that Ms Garner was claiming, that the estate renewal and rehousing payments policy would therefore trump the member agreement. Now, that is not my understanding of what was said at the Cabinet, and this is really important. If the HGV goes ahead, and if there is a member agreement. The issue of whether there are any get-outs, which is the current member agreement that went to the Cabinet, is really a vital issue. I don't think I'm exaggerating. This has to be clear. And if Cabinet's accepting one thing and Lingard is saying something else, we need it clear. And that's why. And so, and we're still waiting for the revised member agreement, which was going to be redrafted, and I haven't had it. I've asked for it.
Okay, what I'm going to do is, because these are issues that are coming from the minutes, and because we've already agreed, okay, that provisionally we will, but from what I've understood, okay, I've kind of jumped the gun a bit because there are more issues with those minutes. So, and I think it's perfectly valid for councillors to be wanting to ask questions about some issues that remain unanswered from those minutes. Now, I'm conscious that we don't have an officer here or a cabinet member to answer those questions. So I'm just concerned that essentially all we're doing is raising the issues. There's nobody here to answer it, and I think that should be noted. Because there are a number of actions here, for example, in the minutes, like update on how the minutes from the shadow board meetings would be published, which I'm not aware we've received. Have we got one? Is it in the notes?
You've got a response. Where it says action is a response.
Okay. Which number is the response on? 4. Sorry, that doesn't answer my question, because I've seen this, and all that says is that and this was quite so is the response that the minutes haven't been approved yet? And how long ago was that? Is there no further update from this?
That's the update that's been provided to those action points.
So I suppose what the question would now be is, how long will it take for those minutes? I mean, I'm conscious that there's nobody here to answer that question. Okay, so I suppose the answer is we don't know when the minutes will be published. Yeah, but I think it's because this meeting was quite some time ago now.
Well, I think the issue was that if there'd been matters arising from these minutes and the
I thought we didn't do matters arising.
if they
So I think what I'm going to say is that we can't approve these minutes actually until the next meeting, because of the questions that have been raised by yourself and just some of the answers that we want, some of the, some more, I'll rephrase that, some more detailed answers on some of the actions, because I do note that there is a very short response there, but I don't think that that's really what we were looking for. So the next item is the budget monitoring.
So this is a budget monitoring report for services within the remit of the Scrutiny panel. It's a budget monitoring report for Q1, period 3. The report's saying that the General Fund is projecting an overspend of £959,000. This is explained in more detail on page 12. For priority 4, in the main, it's a £250,000 saving that's been unmet due to commercial property valuers extending their contracts longer than anticipated. Priority 5 is projecting an overspend of £785,000, but I think we're going to discuss that in more detail next on the agenda. The HRA is reporting a overspend of 411k. So if you just go to, I can give you more detail, page 18. So that's made up of a number of overs and underspends. If I just highlight some of them. So the non-dwelling rents, that's 125k, relates in the main to garage income not being achieved. The tenant service charge income is 256k. So this is the emergency response team where we're not recharging. It's costing us more than the budget allows for, and we're also not recharging all of our costs. The miscellaneous income relates to leaseholders. Leaseholders. In the expenditure side, the non-HFH estate cost is because the waste contract was higher than anticipated. We didn't get details of what the increase was until after we'd set the budget. The recharges for housing management, that's made up of a number of smaller recharges. The other bits are really other property costs. That's a huge underspend. Again, that's insurance has come in about 600k under what we anticipated. Again, it was because we set the budgets before we had the details of the renewal. And the general fund recharges of 368k relates to antisocial behaviour, so the recharge to the HRA is less, again, than anticipated. So this is Q1, and Q2 has just been published but is going to Cabinet. In the main, it's the only main difference in terms of the HRA is that the leaseholder service charge income here, sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down, now is reporting a 417k underspend. So the HRA has actually swung from a 411 overspend to about, I think it's 100k underspend in Q2. And that's because we've got the leaseholder service charge, again, the budget was based on estimates, and we've got better details about how much we're likely to collect this period. Going back to the report, the other bits in here are capital, which is on page 14. So for priority 4, it's reporting a £33 million variance. That's in the main because the High Road West, lots of things are out of our control, and also Marsh Lane relocation budget, that is unlikely to be spent this year. Just an update, in Q4 that actually the variance has gone up to 54 million, and again, most of that will be still slipped into next year. For priority 5, the Q1 saying a £15 million slippage, that's in the main about temporary accommodation solutions which haven't got off the ground. And again, Q2 is saying something similar, that about 13 million of that will slip to next year. There's quite a lot of detail in the capitals in the Cabinet report, so it's a bit too much detail to go over in this meeting. So, that's it.
The capital underspend is huge. Do we just carry it forward happily every year and never spend it?
No, it depends on the scheme. So because capital projects, sometimes we have to wait for invoices to come in, sometimes they don't get off the ground. So by about Q3, definitely at year end, we do an analysis, and where it's clearly not going to be spent anytime soon or the projects have failed, then they get taken back into the corporate pot as underspends, and anything where it is slippage due to external factors, it'll get carried forward to next year.
Sorry, can I just... And you can carry capital forward without any constraints?
You can carry capital forward without any constraints, although as a council we would obviously revisit. We don't want to be carrying forward capital that we don't need, and there is a bidding process, so if other schemes come up that need the money, you know, so they're all carefully looked at year end.
Sorry, Councillor Carter, then Councillor Brabazon.
Thank you, Chair. Could people please turn to page 13? I'm sorry, I'm going to get through this, but I'm feeling pretty crook at the moment. So this is, I do want to ask a question in relation to 6.1 and water rates and money. Now, I don't know if... What? 6.10, halfway, two-thirds of the way down on page 13? Yeah. There was a High Court case, and this is all settled, which may have a bearing on this local authority. A similar borough, which is Southwark, was taken to the High Court in connection with overcharging water rates. I think they were described as they fessed up to charging commission. I think it was worse than that. I think it was. I think they were making a turn, and the court found that they were resellers. And I think that Southwark ended up with a huge bill for recompensing 37,000 tenants. I had a look at their website this evening. Now, where we come to Haringey, there may be other local authorities who are affected, possibly 22 other local authorities. So my question is Haringey one of those affected by this ruling about repayment of the overcharging? Has any money been set aside to deal with this issue? What would be the cost of it, and how many Haringey tenants would be affected, please?
The view that we are taking, or Haringey is taking, in relation to the water charge contracts is tenants haven't been overcharged. They were charged exactly the same as if they paid Thames Water tariff charge. The commission paid by Thames Water covers the cost of collection, with any surpluses going directly to the upkeep and improvement of the council housing stock. And we actually consider that the Jones versus Southwark was wrongly decided, and we're looking at that from a legal perspective at the moment.
I'm not quite clear. Why would you be looking at from a legal perspective if we're unaffected? Are we affected? The question is, could we be caught by this ruling? From your answer, it sounds like we might be caught by it. You disagree with the ruling, but if we're not affected, then it wouldn't matter, surely.
So we've got a very similar contract with Thames Water to Southwark. We've been asked a similar question externally, and the statement I've given to you is exactly as we've given to others. We're considering participating in a test case to challenge that ruling, but as Thames Water contract is similar to Southwark's.
Right, thank you. So we are affected. So now my next question was, or potentially affected, my next question was, has any money been set aside to deal with this? If, you know, the worst came to the worst, and it was all resolved in favour of tenants, how much money, has any money been set aside for the issue? What would be that cost, please? And how many of our tenants would be due for a refund, please?
I can't give you those figures at the moment. There's been no money set aside to deal with any issue, and we're in the process of doing some work around what that would mean if it needed to be.
Councillor Brabazon.
Questions? First one's on page 17. Under priority 4, growth and employment, under the Regeneration Director for Housing and Growth of Q1, it says you're showing an overspend, a projected overspend for the year, I presume that is, of 147,000, 148,000. Is that, what's the position in Q2? That's my first question.
So in Q2, the whole of priority 4 has gone up to 223. I haven't got the breakdown in front of me, but I know that the majority of that is related to the commercial property valuers.
Because this is related to the issue of the HGV and the transfer of the commercial portfolio. Is that correct?
What it's related to is we had a £250,000 saving, and because we were going to not use we wouldn't need commercial valuers because the properties would have transferred, but because now we are still using those commercial valuers and agency staff, so the savings has not been met.
Because the commercial portfolio has not transferred. In other words, am I right in understanding, I just want to be sure I understand it, that the council is still, because the council is still running its own property portfolio, it still needs the valuers. Is that right? Are we still retaining the consultant who was working on the HDV, who was there for a couple of years? Do you know if that post is still retained and would contribute to the cost overspend?
I don't know. I don't know the names and the details. So unless you.
I believe the question is about the post, not the individual.
I don't know. Is that, yeah, I can get back to you, because I know some of the savings was because some posts were deleted, but I don't know which specific posts.
Chair? Hang on. Where am I? Yes. On page 14, on table 3, explain. I'm not quite clear I've understood. Under growth and employment, there's a revised capital budget of 63 million, yes? Have we forecast to spend 30 million at the end of Q1? Is that what that means? And has 30 million...
So that's what's been forecast to be spent. So that's they've got plans in place, or at that point they thought they had plans in place, so 30 million would be spent by the end of the year.
So what you're saying is that the forecast at the end of Q1 was that 30 million would be spent at the end of 17-18. And so what's the forecast now for Q2?
That there's 54 million underspend, but there's also been a cash injection of 10 million, and now it's saying the variance is 54 million at the end of Q2.
Straight, because we haven't got in front of us, the cash injection would bring the capital budget up to 73 million, but the underspend is 54 million. So only 19 million is projected to be spent. Could you clarify on what that 19 million is projected to be spent on? I know from experience capital is very hard to spend. So perhaps you could tell us or whether my experience of years ago is still current.
So, I mean, I suppose my understanding of this is this isn't necessarily a question that you would be able to answer necessarily, that we would need probably somebody at this meeting with more kind of knowledge on what the kind of plans are for that money. So I wouldn't want to put an officer on the spot with a question like that when there is no nobody here present, no senior officer present. So if we could note that question down and get back to you, and I think we may be needing to do that for the rest of the evening.
So, yeah, I was just reading through the report. So it just says that the 19 million will be spent. I haven't got a breakdown of what that relates to. So.
Yeah, that's fine, and I assumed that would be the case. So I think we're going to have to just bear with each other tonight because of some kind of more information we may need. So, I'm quite happy for councillors to ask questions on issues, but if there isn't an answer that anybody present here can give, then we'll note it down.
That we ask, that our clerk asks on behalf of us, some more clarity on para 7.6, which is headlines about priority 4. I think it would be useful for this committee to have a bit more detail. For example, what is happening with the High Road West business acquisitions budget? There are all lots of issues now, seems to me, about High Road West because of the intervention of Spurs with their planning application. Then the whole issue of the strategic sites acquisition budget, it would be useful for us in understanding what's going on here if we could get a briefing which is more detailed.
So I think that's fair enough, and I suppose what we can take from this is there are going to be lots of questions this evening that can't be answered, and I think what we do therefore is, rather than going through a series of questions that people ask, that the panel members put those questions in writing by email, and that we can get those answers as soon as possible. What I would say, however, is I don't want that to be through the members' inquiry process, because that takes too long to get an answer. If the officers were present tonight, we would be getting answers as and when. So I don't want to have a response which says we'll get back to you in 10 days. I think because of the circumstances that we should get those answers as quickly as possible.
Paragraph 7.9, it says here in the report, it's estimated the priority will spend circa 30 million capital this financial year, but clearly what we're hearing on the projections of that is not the case. So I do think we need some clarity. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I take that on board, and as I said, if members could pull together any questions that they have, send them through to Christian over the next couple of days, and we will make sure that those questions are answered within a timely manner.
Para 7.11, which is related to temporary accommodation, the capital budget. I don't know whether you could give us any clarity about where you are in the 11.1 million capital for temporary, or whether that forms part of the presentation. Because clearly that is a very interesting area to find out about.
Yeah, that is going to be covered in the next item, which is about capital expenditure to acquire temporary accommodation. So shall I cover it then, if that's okay? Sure.
Thank you, Amina. I just wanted this to be on the record, and I've forgotten if I said it or not, but my question is, can you help me? Did I say the following or not? That, or to the officer, I did check on the Southwark Council website shortly before coming here this evening, and it did say that the overcharging would be refunded, not that it was still in doubt. There were means of Southwark tenants to go about obtaining their refunds, and anybody can check that website. There was no doubt. It was not ambiguous or, subject to something else, something later on. You can check yourself. Anyone can check it. There we go. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
That brings us to the next item, which is the temporary accommodation reduction plan, and that's over to you, Alan.
These, I think, will start.
Okay, so the report is pages 21 to 24 in the pack, but we've circulated a brief presentation which we will go through quite quickly so that there is more time for discussion and questions. So concentrating on the slide pack. On the first slide, so really what the kind of outflow acknowledges is just very simply that the temporary accommodation situation is about addressing both demand but also looking at what we can do to increase supply. So in this particular diagram, people going into temporary accommodation is the blue bars, people coming out is the red, and whenever more people come out, then obviously our temporary accommodation numbers go down. So we've seen our numbers fall by half, as we discussed last time, heading to 2010. And after that, we saw a kind of slow but steady increase that has more recently kind of settled out. And for the first few months now, we are seeing a reduction for reasons that we will go into briefly. So the next slide is just looking at some of the demand things that have helped that number start to reduce. So we have seen an increase in the number of cases where we've been able to prevent homelessness, and so we are on track to achieve 40% by year end. We've been doing some work looking at the effect of prevention because we were worried that people just keep on coming back round again. But actually, once cases are resolved and people have found other options, actually not that many people do return. So we were just interested in looking at, if we invest in finding private rented, for example, do people just keep on recycling? But that isn't the evidence at the moment, so we are confident in the prevention work. As a result, our homelessness acceptances have decreased, so they were higher, as you can see, in 2013-14. In the first quarter of this year, we did 115, so we are on track for fewer homeless acceptances than we've seen in previous years. The time it takes as well to make homeless decisions has reduced significantly, so we are now making most of our decisions in 33 working days, which is much better than in 16-17, so people are getting their decisions much more quickly. Our acceptance rate is 45%, so this is when people make homeless applications, the proportion of those applications that we accept and give a full housing duty to people. And we've seen our kind of flow into, as we saw in the previous diagram, reduce from on average 79 a month to just less than 50. At the moment. Part of the reason for that is we this year have had more success around finding private sector accommodation than we'd had for the last 2 years. So we're on target for 300 ASTs this year, which are a mix of preventing people becoming homeless in the first place and discharging our homeless duty for people who are already in temporary accommodation. On the next slide, just very briefly, some of the ways that we've done that. So we did restructure just over a year ago now, and that kind of gave us a structure that was more fit for purpose for addressing some of the challenges we were facing. We do have a range of things in place for prevention. We have a prevention fund. We do a lot of work with the Housing Improvement team, looking at the kind of private sector and the use of the Deregulation Act, which gives us an opportunity to delay evictions and to work with the tenants. A lot of work around robust decision making. We now have a Chief Immigration Officer co-located with us, so we can make eligibility decisions much more quickly, both positive ones and negative ones. That means that we can speed up that decision for the household. We're doing a lot of work on move on from temporary accommodation. As I said, we've currently got 3,056 households in TA. Some, as you will know, has been there for a very long time. So we've got some people who've been there for many, many years who are waiting to move on into social housing, and people who've moved in more recently who we are more likely to move into the private sector, because there's a distinction in 2011 between when people moved into temporary accommodation and what their outcome can be. Despite all of the work on prevention, the situation, and the budget situation in particular, remains very challenging. So although we are seeing the numbers in TA go down, we're not seeing that reflected so much in a budget reduction, and as you heard in the discussion, we're still projecting a budget overspend of around about £800,000. The way the budget was set when we were first looking at the sort of temporary accommodation assumed both a reduction in numbers and particular assumptions about the type of temporary accommodation that people will be in. And so some of the initiatives for temporary accommodation have gone well. So we do have our own shared facility hostel that allowed us to stop using Northumberland Park and bed and breakfast. And we've just opened a second one of those, which Alan will speak about in a minute. We are using properties that are empty due to regeneration as temporary accommodation in the short term. But some of the things that we wanted to do around finding more long-term leased accommodation has proven difficult because landlords have got other options in the market. We haven't done the level of acquisitions that were expected, and the result is that we are still heavily reliant on nightly rated accommodation. So this is self-contained accommodation, but that we pay for on a nightly basis, which makes it more costly than any of the longer-term options. I'll talk a little bit about the management fee and the flexible homelessness support grant a little bit later on, but Alan's going to talk about supply.
The second side of trying to reduce our expenditure and the numbers of people in temporary accommodation, as well as dealing with the people coming in and dealing with the demand side, is to try and increase the supply of better quality, more appropriate, affordable accommodation for them. And we've got a number of initiatives we're trying to roll out over this year and next year. Firstly, we're looking at our current stock of ASTs, short-term tenancies. We've got a private rented guarantee scheme. Yeah, that's why I filled that out immediately afterwards, and I realised. I do apologise. Yes, I do apologise. So we're trying to roll out an increased number of short-term tenancies. These are basically private rented properties that we can place people in who are homeless in temporarily. We had in this room itself, we had a meeting of the Landlord Forum for the borough quite recently. We talked about our schemes, and particularly the guaranteed rent scheme, which landlords are very encouraged to try and take up. Also, a supported letting scheme we're going to look to support people so they don't lose their tenancies, because access tenancies don't lose them. But the key one, I think, in the private rented sector is to try to convert some of the least but good quality, some of the worst homes we have, which are also some of the most expensive, where we place people in nightly paid accommodation, and where we pay them per night to house people. These are usually rather the less favourable accommodation we have. But what was striking to me when I came in and saw the figures for this is that just 30 landlords own virtually all of our nightly paid accommodation. That's 1,500 homes between them. We've been starting to meet these landlords, myself, Denise and our teams, to try and talk them into whether they would be willing to convert these nightly paid accommodation into a short-haul tenancies, where we could place somebody for much more secure, longer tenancy. And actually, we've been quite struck by their willingness to do so and move into the scheme. So we'll come on a little later about how we're going to finance that. We have a big hope to reduce the number of people in temporary accommodation, but also, more importantly, to move them into better accommodation. Part of that process of moving to better accommodation is the opening of lodges. We had 2 now open. Broadwater Lodge we opened early in this year, February, March, which is completely full, and Whitehall Lodge, which we just opened in November, which has 21 rooms. And the advantage of these is a triple advantage again here. It costs us a lot less to fund them than it would do to put people into emergency accommodation. We actually make some income out of it, so it significantly brings down our costs. But most importantly, third advantage, it's a much better quality home for those people that are in that emergency accommodation than being in nightly paid. So again, that's a saving for us, but actually better quality as well as a saving, as it would be for moving people out of nightly paid into private rented accommodation. In the next page, a number of other initiatives we're looking at other lodges potentially. We have been looking at some potential in Enfield, though we're now questioning whether that's actually a good move. We're looking at other accommodation that may be available from conversions of former industrial units in this borough instead. We are setting up, or looking to set up, and there'll be a cabinet report going with some of these initiatives in the next process by January, we hope at the latest, looking at have a form of purchase repair programme. We'd work in partnership with the Housing Association to acquire stock, mostly the bottom end of the private rented sector currently. A lot of them might have been former right to buys, and we'd actually lease that stock from the Housing Association for a number of years, and some of the schemes we're looking at the end of that, we'd acquire that stock and it becomes social housing for the borough. So the borough would actually acquire that stock at the end. So we're looking at a deal we could potentially put together with a housing association to do that scheme. Absolutely, yes. So I'm happy to take a lot of questions on these. That would be a scheme, if we did that, which wouldn't require us to put capital or any income or even any land or any other assets of ours into it, but we'd give a form of guarantee about, we'd provide occupancy, so we'd guarantee, we'd provide people to take that accommodation. In addition to that, we're looking at potentially setting up either a wholly owned company as a vehicle, or potentially a charity, a community or cooperative society instead, which could acquire stock for us. That would be a way we put capital into that scheme, unlike the purchase and repair programme, and we'd acquire stock that we could use and own, which could be managed by Haringey as council housing, or it could be managed as private rented sector, short-haul tenancies. We are also in negotiations. We've had the first meeting, we'll have a second meeting very shortly with Notting Hill, who are just merging with Genesis Housing Association. Genesis are the only housing association that still have a significant stock of private sector leased properties in the borough that they let us use for temporary accommodation, though they were looking to reduce that as every other housing association have. Fortuitously, Notting Hill Housing Group are doing the opposite. They're looking to move into that market. We had a meeting with them about a week before their merger was announced, and Notting Hill were keen to work with us to help acquire some stock for us as private sector leasehold. So they'll take over the Genesis stock, and we're looking to increase the number of homes they can provide. So again, that's about providing a better quality home than the nightly paid, but also at a lower cost to us. And finally, we're also looking at a direct acquisitions programme where we do use the capital we have just to acquire stock in the borough, primarily looking at leasehold stock, primarily probably looking at former right to buy stock that we could buy back in the borough and use as temporary accommodation. So we have a capital allowance in the programme for that. And going back to the questions before about the 11.1 million capital, the proposals going forward to the Cabinet by January for these vehicles or for the acquisitions programme would be how we'd use that capital and additional capital that's underspent in the borough. How was the next bit yours?
You can do it if you want.
The next bit is an important bit alongside the capital things I was talking about. Was about how the government is funding temporary accommodation going forward. It made a major change in this financial year. They replaced what used to be called the Temporary Accommodation Management Fund, which is basically a £40 per week top-up for the on housing benefit for the people we placed in temporary accommodation, with what's now called a Flexible Homelessness Support Grant. We actually got quite a good settlement out of that comparatively to the rest of London boroughs and the rest of the country. The settlement in total was about 8.6 million in this year and 8.2 million in the next year. The figures here are slightly wrong in the presentation. But overall, it's a quite significant, more money than we currently have we'll be spending on that £40 per week top-ups. So actually that's put us in a position where we have some revenue funding, as well as the capital I mentioned earlier, to try and fund these initiatives I was just talking about. The money is ostensibly ring-fenced for work on homelessness and temporary accommodation, and we have clearly negotiations with the corporate finance to make sure we spend as much of that money as we possibly can on doing so. And though, as I said, we have to offset that £40 a week loss for housing benefit, we still think there's significant money over and above that £40 per week that will be available for these temporary accommodation initiatives. But this is only up to the end of next year. We don't know after 2018-19 for sure how much money the government will set aside for this funding. So it's very important for us to use this money as best we can to reduce the numbers in temporary accommodation, because by 2019-2020 we really have no clue at this point exactly how much financial risk we face if the government changes as it will do, the funding regime going forward. The other thing to take into account in this reducing temporary accommodation is the introduction of the Homeless Reduction Act, and Denise is far more of an expert on that than me. I'll leave that bit to her.
Okay, so we touched on this when I was here last time. So we have confirmation that the Homelessness Reduction Act will operate from April 2018. This is the biggest change in homelessness legislation that we've seen in 40 years. It is a real shift in the approach and adds a real emphasis to a kind of homelessness prevention duty. It significantly increases the responsibilities of the council to a much wider range of people who are facing homelessness compared to the current legislation. So I won't do this in detail because it would be a topic in its own right, except to flag just some of the implications for Haringey, which is on the final slide. It's recognised that this will bring additional pressures. We're expected to see many more people and to do a lot more work with them around homelessness prevention, which is a positive thing. And we've received new burdens money from government of just over 1.2 million, some for this year and the rest for the remaining 2 years. So we are out to, well, we've completed consultation on a restructure of the service that's at the front line to strengthen the kind of capacity there and the work that we need to do. There will be funding implications around IT, etc. And we get some additional responsibilities around reviews and storage and kind of some smaller items. There is a risk that even though the settlement was more than we thought it might be, that the new burdens money might not be enough, because it is difficult at the moment to anticipate the increase in demand. So boroughs have done some analysis of this, and the predictions vary between 50 to 300%. Based on our understanding in the borough, we are thinking nearer to the 50% end of that, but nonetheless that is a significant increase in people that we need to engage with at a time when there is still limited housing supply, which makes the supply initiatives particularly important. So implementation is underway in Haringey. The intention is there will be member briefings, etc., and training sessions, because it involves a greater range of people in referring people to us and being involved in the kind of solutions and prevention.
Just to say that just on the Homelessness Reduction Act, which I think was had some good stuff in it, but the main issue is that it basically increases your responsibilities without funding you properly, right? And I mean really, you know, the wide support for it in Parliament just kind of like sums up how they just don't have a clue what's going on in local government. They just have no clue. But just in terms of the likely increase in TA usage, so that's basically undoing all the stuff that you've just told us, isn't it? It's undoing all your work that you're trying to. I mean, what's the assessment on where that will come out in net? Let's say you take what Alan was talking about there, and then we take your likely increased TA stuff there. What's the net difference?
So there was a concern originally that for the wider range of people that we needed to see, we'd also have a duty to place them in temporary accommodation. The government backed away from that because the recognition was that would be just hugely, hugely costly. But what it does do is for people we can't prevent, there's an extra stage now in the way we work with people that's called the relief stage. So we can't kind of complete our homeless investigation for 56 days. We have to keep people somewhere while we work with them and try and find a solution. So partly linked back to what Alan said about developing more hostels, we need somewhere where people are safe and secure so we can continue to work with them on a solution. So in our projections going forward, we don't anticipate accepting a full homeless duty to more people because the priority need and all the things still finally apply at the very end. But we do anticipate needing to accommodate some more people in that interim period, which is why the kind of hostel development, so that it's a place that's not costly. So the numbers may go up, but the cost shouldn't, because it's a place where either we can break even on the cost or make a small surplus. So the hostel development is particularly important in that setting. So we do expect a small increase in our numbers, but we're trying to mitigate the impact on cost for that.
Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Councillor. You said you had been investigating lodges in Enfield and then sort of hinted that you were no longer doing that and were looking at elsewhere in Haringey. Can I ask for some background on that?
Surely, yes. We did a search to try and find available potential properties that could be converted in the local area. This local borough and boroughs just outside it. We commissioned this research and it came back with what looked at first very promising opportunities in Enfield. One literally just above over the border, virtually at Bounds Green, one further away in Enfield. As we looked at them, we did the financial appraisals as you would, see if they stacked up financially and would save us money, and they would. They were both very close to transport. They would get people in and across the borough very, very closely. It becomes more difficult, we think, on this one because, bless you, we were expecting that our original calculations were all done on having vacant possession. It does seem those two particular lodges we're looking at are still currently being used for housing older people, and therefore there could be all sorts of reputational risks to the council here, as well as potential difficulties if we were seen as turfing old people out of their homes in Enfield in order to house people in temporary accommodation. And Enfield might be more churlish about it than we originally thought. So maybe we weren't sold the best thing when we first looked at that. So we're probably not taking those further, though we will have conversations with Enfield to see what they know about them. And if they do turn out to be viable or doable, then they certainly are viable economically for us to do so, and good quality properties. We're now looking instead back into the borough again. We're looking at 2 or 3 places that come to us, but very initial in the conversations with them, which are former industrial units that could potentially be converted, ones that already have planning permission for that conversion, whether we can use them for lodges. As Denise was saying, the Homeless Reduction Act will require us to have somewhere to place people for this longer period. So it's essential we find something that's A, economic, but B, is a good quality, and we don't have to go back into putting people into nightly paid accommodation, which we certainly don't want.
Councillor Brabazon and then Councillor Carter.
I'd like to ask, we heard about the £11 million, the capital, and there's somewhere in here that says 16 million or something revenue by properties. Can you clarify where you've got to? Are you buying street level properties, or is this all going to happen when you've set up a company? What actually is the plan?
Okay, but I don't want to go through the detail of the number. I'm going to give an outline of them, because what's probably quite useful to do is, as we take the report through Cabinet, we can bring it back here and actually really unpick the numbers in detail. We'll have all of the stuff in front of me here. The key principles behind it are that we did underspend on that 11.1 million in capital. This is, we had a number of things that were planned to spend the money on, which didn't happen. We had a modular scheme which we were considering. We had a modular housing development, which is a sort of prefabricated, off-site manufactured housing development. But the site we were looking at was actually, we'd have to get permission to change use from the Secretary of State, from educational use into potential housing use. We are starting that process now, but that takes, understandably, quite a long time. It requires consultation with the schools and the local community. So that got delayed. That was one plan to spend it on. Second plans we had were to acquire some more street properties in the borough, which didn't quite take off. But now we have got our first acquisitions going through the pipeline, and should be purchased before Christmas. So some of that money will now get spent. We also have plans to invest in a scheme called Real Lettings, run by St Mungo's and another charity. But that was given permission by, or given the go-ahead to do that by Cabinet on the proviso that we could invest our right to buy receipts in it, but our lawyers required us to consult DCLG whether that be doable, and DCLG said that rather we didn't. So unfortunately that scheme didn't go ahead. So there were a number of schemes that were planned to go ahead and they didn't. And this is one of the core reasons why we really are keen as officers to have engaged with members to work out how we can set up a structure that we're entirely in control of to get the money spent. The other way we didn't spend money, we had plans to spend for example, our right to buy receipts on Monument Way, with a development there with Notting Hill, to invest in that to get some social rented housing there. That fell over, and a significant amount of capital would have gone into that because of problems with TfL and their planning. So the more you're reliant on other people at arm's length to do things, the harder it is to do it. So we want to set up a vehicle that we will be able to say, we can definitely get the money in here, definitely get the money spent. We had too many things going on, too many ideas, and not enough things that were simple, doable, and in our own control, which is why we're proposing to set up probably a reporting moment, a wholly owned company for the council, and presumably a charity as well.
Okay, so I've got a question now. So I suppose mine's more of a broader picture one rather than any of the specific things in the presentation. So obviously, as we all know, there are significant plans for regeneration over the next few years, and that's obviously going to have an impact on our spending on temporary accommodation and waiting times. So obviously if people are being moved from properties that are going to be regenerated, then obviously they need to be housed immediately. What are your anticipations on what the cost impact of that will be, and also the waiting times for people who are already who have been on our waiting list for some time? Because some of the answers that we've been getting is that the benefits of the proposed scheme is that it will benefit the thousands of people on our waiting lists. What do you anticipate will be the immediate or long-term time frame for when actually somebody who's sitting on a waiting list now will realistically be rehoused? Because obviously the people being moved out of those schemes or those general needs properties will have priority in terms of whether it's temporary accommodation or rehousing.
Yeah, the impact of regeneration on homes and temporary accommodation has different impacts in different ways of the regeneration scheme where it is. It was also made more complicated. Most schemes happen in phases, and so it has a different impact in different phases. In the first instance, before you start the regeneration, once you announce you're going to do a major estate renewal scheme, then as people start to move off, you tend not to put people in that are going to be on permanent secure tenancies on the basis. As you start a regeneration scheme, you announce the scheme is going to happen, but before you start actually knocking anything down, at some point before you start knocking things down, you start thinking we won't anymore put people in there who are on permanent secure council tenancies because you're not giving them a permanent secure home. We should be giving them. No, you do fill up the voids, but you tend to fill up the voids with people who would be otherwise in temporary accommodation. So you put people in who are in temporary accommodation. So the immediate impact is beneficial on homelessness from a regeneration scheme. Once you actually start knocking things down on that particular development, then there's an impact the one you get to, which is negative, because people then are coming out of that scheme and you need to rehouse them somewhere else in your other temporary accommodation. But then the third impact is when you build those new homes, and they tend to be, and certainly our plans here are to build more family-sized homes, less one-beds, then there's a beneficial impact because you're building homes that people can move into. So it's how the impact changes over time in a regeneration scheme on temporary accommodation. And it changes because different schemes, you might have more than one scheme going on at different phases, and they happen. We are trying to map out, we have in fact mapped out all the schemes that we plans across the borough. We mapped out what likely impact is going to be in terms of the availability of homes for temporary accommodation and the demand on temporary accommodation from people coming out of the schemes. And generally, it washes its face and it's generally beneficial all the way through. There are certain pinch points you get, particularly around one-bedroom accommodation, because there's an awful lot of the plans currently are to replace one-bedroom homes in social housing on the major estates with more 2, 3, and particularly 3-bedroom homes, family-sized homes. So you get a pinch points around the one-bedroom homes at certain points, which is a bit more difficult. But generally for family sizes, the overall impact is definitely beneficial, but in most phases it remains beneficial.
Councillor Brabazon.
It was really interesting. But if you took, for example, Love Lane estate, where lots of people have been moved off, I understand there are currently, I think, 65 secure tenants remaining at Love Lane, and the rest are temporary. The question I really want to ask is about obviously it's good that people are housed, that goes without saying, and these are, as far as I know, Parker Morris standard homes, which means they're to a high standard and good, spacious. I've not been in them, but that's what I've heard. But the issue about people who are now there in a temporary situation, who may not know how long they're going to be there, under that sort of pressure, notwithstanding what secure tenants are feeling, what's the knock-on on other aspects of housing maintenance and the life of the community, if you like, there, given the fact that people are in such a state of flux? Am I being clear? And people who may have very big, significant problems, all being congregated in that way. Because you could say, although I take the people are housed, that this is inimical to actually what we want about mixed communities. We're doing it because of this rush to knock it all down, to the reverse. I'm really interested in what the impact is for Haringey, Homes for Haringey, and how you manage the actual day-to-day implications of what this churn and turbulence that's been created.
Okay. A couple of things there. Firstly, the people that were housing in temporary accommodation, and the people who would very well, some of those people, be the people we might house in permanent secure accommodation if that was available to them on that estate. So if that estate wasn't being knocked down, some of those identically same people would be in there, but they'd be on secure permanent tenancies, not in temporary accommodation. And they don't tend to be in there for a very short period. This is not a very quick turnover. They're not it's not emergency accommodation. These are settled families that might be there for 2, 3 or 4 years in the process of regeneration. You know how long these schemes take. So there is not that vast turnover. In terms of looking at the quality of the stock, then we would still do ongoing maintenance, ongoing improvements, etc. What we wouldn't do is any of the major works that might otherwise be needed, the major works that require the regeneration in the first place. But the council or Homes for Haringey would still continue a programme of making sure the homes are healthy, safe, etc. So yes, there is an impact. It's not quite a settled community. People know they're not there for secure tenancies, and this council has maintained secure tenancies quite rightly to try and give people security. There isn't that, but these are fairly settled people for a fairly settled period, and the homes do continue to get looked after.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. The title of the report is Temporary Accommodation Reduction, and that is a noble aim. It's obviously forward-looking, and we do have a housing crisis. It's never been stated explicitly that the development vehicle would address temporary people in temporary accommodation, but it's kind of been hinted that it will help. Now, I've never been able to work. Yeah, it follows up from what you were saying earlier, Amina. This is a hell of a lot of people. 3,000. I think it in terms of 3 times the size of my secondary school, which is about 1,000. It's a lot of people. So I've never been able to work out how the development vehicle would address this problem. You must have thought about this. Now, are you able to confirm that the HDV will have no impact on temporary accommodation? And if not, could you outline in as much detail as possible how the HDV will improve this situation? Because I've never been able to work it out. Thank you.
Okay, I would say one thing. You're right about the staggering level of numbers, but it's not 3,000 people, it's 3,000 households. So actually, it's a lot worse than that. It's a lot more than 3 of your schools, it's 4 or 5 of your schools, which is a really shocking number. And it does make Homes for Haringey's temporary accommodation service the biggest housing association in the borough, bluntly, with that many people in temporary accommodation. Because the second biggest has got 2,500, and that's L&Q. So it's a very large population, and they're not in the homes we'd like them to be in. The HDV won't itself be a provider of temporary accommodation for the council. It's not intended to set up to acquire or produce or do temporary accommodation. Though some of the homes that will transfer into it, if it happens, would be used for temporary accommodation in the meantime, as we discussed, as has happened at Love Lane. So the impact that HDV would have would be the same impact if it was anybody else doing that regeneration. It would have that cycle of being beneficial to temporary accommodation in the first instance when the homes are being emptied out prior to the demolition. It would have a negative impact on temporary accommodation when it's knocked down and people need to be housed, and then have a positive impact afterwards when the new homes are built. So it's about mapping that change over that time. Which is, I say, that when we did the piece of work to look at the impacts of these, we included all the potential HDV schemes in phase one.
Yeah, well, I would like to follow up as well. That the positive impact you mentioned, I can see the negative impact, absolutely, but then you briskly said there would be a positive impact. That's the bit I don't really get. You do. You do. Yeah.
So, from my understanding of what you're saying, Alan, is that we're talking in numbers. We're not talking positive impact as in, isn't it a great thing? We're talking sheer kind of statistics. So, for example, the fact that those properties will be decanted, okay, so people will be displaced, and then they empty up properties, unfortunately, means that the people who are in expensive either emergency accommodation or waiting to be placed into temporary accommodation will be able to occupy those flats. So that in that sense, it has a positive impact because literally you're moving one group of people and replacing them with another. And that kind of helps you kind of balance out those statistics, but that isn't a reason why we would do something like that, and I think that's what needs to be clarified. You don't move people around so that you can kind of, in a sense, improve your figures, because it has a negative impact in and of itself on the people experiencing it. My understanding is that the negative impact then comes when those estates are brought down and you have to move out the remaining secure tenants and the temporary accommodation tenants and find somewhere for them to go, and that will cause a blockage in the system, in a sense, because then you're going to have people in temporary accommodation that previously were in permanent accommodation and now are within the system of TA. And but then you come back and say, well, then it will in future have a positive impact, because in theory, what you're saying is you increase the number of properties at the end of it, so you have a net increase. Now, this is where we need clarification on, because that's where we still haven't had answers, and we're waiting for clarification, is what the net increase will be in whether it's secure or whether it's permanent. You can't use the term secure tenancies because we've been told that they won't be secure tenancies in the way that we understand it. But what we, I suppose, need an answer on, and I don't think you can answer that, is what the net increase will be in properties that will then be available to rehouse those people who've left the estate, as well as the people that have been waiting for a long time. So the question is, what we've been told previously is that the reason why we must do this is because we've got so many people waiting currently in temporary accommodation. Now, what I want to know is at what point somebody who is in temporary accommodation now will see the impact. So if is it going to be in 4 years' time, or is it going to be in 5 years' time, or is it going to be I don't need the actual figure, but at what point will somebody who we've heard the argument of is in desperate need of permanent accommodation will see the impact of that? Because if it's families, then if a young child is 6 years old now in temporary accommodation, are they, as a result, going to be in permanent by the time they're 8, okay, whereas previously it would have been by the time they're 9, or will in effect they still be in temporary accommodation but waiting longer than they would have done because of this blockage that's created in the system?
Okay, it's quite hard to think of a particular family and a particular point at which time the 6-year-old will get a home. What I was trying to say, whether it's... I know, What I'm trying to say, whether there are three phases, it doesn't matter if it's HDV or if it's council doing it itself or a housing association doing it, whoever does this, the regeneration scheme, and whatever the numbers themselves are, the principle is the same, is that at first there's a positive impact of doing a regeneration scheme on temporary accommodation because you create a lot of temporary accommodation. Second phase, when you knock it down, there's a negative impact. So that on its own would be negative because the people have to come out. And the third phase, on its own, ignoring the first two again, there's a positive impact because you're building a lot more homes and people move into them. So that's where there's a positive impact in the third part. If you build homes where there aren't any homes, people move into them, that's a positive impact. So negative, positive, negative. The question overall is that beneficial overall? This is a scheme. Are the three phases beneficial? And our calculation is, yes, it's very much beneficial, particularly because you're producing at the end a larger number of family-sized homes that we really need rather than one beds, and people can move up and be better accommodated. But these...
Let me put it a different way. I don't really follow what your logic here. Perhaps I'm being dim, and I accept that you are much more knowledgeable about housing than I am. But we are reducing the supply every time the whole business of the HDV is that we will be reducing housing supply for our needy families because we're going to be in the immediate term because we're transferring property to a private company, so it's not our housing anymore. That's number one. And number two, we're moving people from what was our housing into voids, which is still our housing, which reduces overall the number of homes available for people on the list because the number is shrinking. If you're removing 1,000 properties from the ownership of Homes for Haringey, then we have, or the council, from the council, thanks Paul, from the council, then we have 1,000 fewer homes that are available as the voids come up. So I don't understand this about it's making it all better. All it is, it's moving bits about and we're trying to put a quart into a pint pot, it seems to me. And I just think that, that there are better ways, obviously, to provide housing than to start by all these contortions with the private company and all the rest of it. I think there are much better ways, and I'm much more interested to know about how we can develop our own company, what you were saying. Well, first of all, I don't think that everything you said is beneficial because housing supply is reduced overall. That seems to me. And even if the HDV were to produce all the homes it says it would produce, there is no guarantee any of those homes would be available because we haven't even begun to talk about viability and costs and numbers and what's social, what's affordable, and all those arguments that we've been having for months and months on which there is still no clarity. So can I come to my question that I wanted to ask? Two questions. One is, how far along are you in this development of this wholly owned company which you've mentioned? And secondly, how many households in the red, you've got stuff here in red on page 5 of the presentation, the households placed a significant distance from London. Are you saying that there is an increase? Is that what that says, or that this is what you're trying to stop?
Thank you, Chair. I would just note that in the report there is no mention of the HDV, and yet this is a forward-looking report. I think this is at once remarkable and yet unsurprising. I mean, I'm not surprised that that HDV doesn't figure. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I did fortunately, this comes in a PDF. It comes in a PDF form, and one can execute a very quick search for the words HDV or Haringey Development Vehicle. It didn't come up. Now, I think it's both unsurprising and remarkable. Now, if there was this forward-looking report, that's good. If there was going to be a positive impact by the HDV, would one not expect it to be mentioned and credited in the report? That's my little question. Thank you very much.
But I might ask for some clarification again, because my mind is, again, thinking of some more questions.
Councillor Priest. Well, I did mention HDV because I was told not to use acronyms. Otherwise, I clearly would have. You know, but the Haringey Development. No. But the other core reason why it's not in here, or regeneration particularly strongly mentioned in here, is this is very much focused on the next 2 or 3 years, what we can do in the very short term. This is what we're trying to achieve here. We're looking at potential financial cliff edge in 2020. So what we can get up and running this year and next year that's going to start to make a real difference. As you go forward into the longer term, whether it's the Haringey Development Vehicle or anyone else doing regeneration, or however regeneration is done, it still goes through those same phases I was talking about. It's about sequencing about these homes and when they're available. And the test is you need to look at those schemes themselves and see when are they going to produce their homes and what mix of homes they're going to produce, and are they going to produce a better mix that will better meet your need. That's the assumption of why you go into regeneration in the first place, to improve the quality of the homes of the people that live there and to provide more homes that are better meet your housing need. And the intention is as far as I'm aware, to do so. I'm not going to answer for the HDV, but the key thing in any regeneration scheme I've been involved in any borough is the mapping those 3 phases. And the last phase, normally, the ones I've been involved in, does produce more family-sized, social rented, affordable homes for people to go into, which has a very beneficial effect on your temporary accommodation. So you need to see it across those 3 phases. And it's not just about moving, because the key thing at the first phase is a lot of people are moving out. Some are moving out to other homes in the borough, but many are moving out because it's the end of their tenancy. Either they're leaving London altogether, or they're dying and moving on. And those are the homes we're replacing. So it's not just moving people around. It's about how you make best use of your stock over that period.
So I suppose where I'm still confused. Oh, go on.
You raised the issue about increasing households placed outside London. The reason those items are in red, those are things we haven't done. And one of the things we actually looked at quite strongly over the last few months is whether we should be significantly increasing the number of homes that people that could move out of London. We decided to move away from that. We are still moving a very, very small number out, who are all voluntary moves, people that do decide they want to return back to the town from which they originally came. We're not moving anyone out against their will. It's a handful, literally, single figures in any monthly period. And we're not looking at that. Same as this is the reason why we didn't spend some of our capital, as I'm saying here. We didn't get the new acquisitions, and we failed to reduce accommodation. But no, there are no plans to increase the number of people rehoused outside London.
So,
she did ask that question, yes, indeed, and I didn't answer. I apologise. We're not far along at all in the sense of actually we're drafting a report at the moment to go to Cabinet. It won't take long to set up. We're looking at the models that happen in other authorities, but there are some key questions to ask. We already have a wholly owned company, a wholly owned housing company, which is Homes of Haringey, and Homes of Haringey could potentially do some of these roles. But is there an advantage if we're also looking to set up, as we're thinking, a charitable cooperative society as well, which Tower Hamlets have just done? It's a real model we're looking at. If we're going to take that through the process, there's marginal additional costs and effort, legals and finances, etc., to set up another wholly owned company that could potentially build and acquire stock for you. But we have to look at the question ourselves. Will we have an existing wholly owned company? Could we use that instead?
So I want to go back to because I'm slightly again concerned about the maths in terms of what you were saying earlier about temporary accommodation initially having a positive impact because you've got a number of homes that will be vacated. But I suppose I'm trying to understand how that works because, so I don't know, how can I describe it? So you've got here 3 glasses of water, you know, and you know, and this is your accommodation that you've got at the moment. This is your waiting list, okay, and this is your temporary accommodation. Once you start vacating the people here, they have to be moved here, and then you move these people in here. But you've still only got 3 glasses of water. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't actually... So even though you're moving some people into the vacated properties, you're still having to move those people who are in the temporary accommodation who are in the permanent accommodation into the temporary accommodation. So if these people weren't being... So if this group of people weren't being moved here, they would be moved there. So it's no net increase.
Yes, fighting my microphone. The point is that not everybody that's moving out and decanted or moving out of the HEAM schemes that are going to be redeveloped, moving into other council accommodation or social accommodation in the borough. Many leaving the borough altogether. There's a natural turnover in all tenancies of people are either dying or moving on or leaving London. These things happen anyway. Those are sometimes vacated. Yes, but if they're having a regeneration, then we're moving people in. If the scheme wasn't being regenerated, they'd be available for permanent secure lettings, and we'd give people secure tenancies. We wouldn't be using them as temporary accommodation.
That's accepted, but I'm still trying to understand where there is a positive impact, because you've still got the same amount of people with the same, but actually you've got more people going into temporary. So even though you've got this group of people that will move in, they would normally have moved into the other temporary accommodation that you're now decanting into. Yes, you're going to have people who are impermanent that would move because, you know, that's what they choose to do, but that's almost like you get a positive impact because you're giving them a little bit of a push or in some kind of a... Do you see where I'm coming from here? So the positive impact is actually... is not a positive impact, it's just you're giving people a nudge to move along.
It might be helpful if we share maybe the effect it's had on our lettings plan. So we describe every year who our lets will go to, and at times of regeneration we have to set aside a number of lets to... I suppose what it would show is... For example, this year we've set aside 65 lets that would go to people who were moving out of Love Lane. That means that 65 lets aren't available for any other use. So it doesn't make any more lets, so it just shows how the movement works and the level. But could you... For, yeah. Yeah. So the proportion of lets that would... Yeah, you will go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, we're trying to go back to your own juncture earlier, not to look at positive and negative as a judgment. Just look at numbers, pure number thing, and then in numbers has impact. Yeah.
Okay, so any more questions on that?
Genesis and Notting Hill. Genesis has publicised and promoted itself as being a provider of TA, not always of, I mean, let's say mixed, shall we? And now Notting Hill Housing Trust want to enter this market. It does worry me about how they're going to be managed or regulated, or what intervention the council are going to have about quality and standards if these housing associations are doing that. I'd just like you to comment on that, really.
Genesis do have a mixed reputation, it's probably fair to say, as Genesis aren't in the room, probably best not mention it, in the housing association sector as a landlord, and in terms of their desire as an organisation to grow. And some of their sort of failed mergers previously may be a signal for something in the organisation. The Notting Hill takeover Genesis is probably a very good thing for their tenants and also for us. Notting Hill are a housing association, they're a registered charity, as are Genesis. They will be acquiring stock in the way that Genesis currently do. And I was here again at a landlords forum a couple of weeks ago where the people from Genesis were here talking to landlords about what the offer is. They would give landlords a guaranteed repair scheme. They would actually manage the tenancy in terms of being the landlord function. They would actually be responsible for collecting the rent, returning that property to the landlord in good repair at the end, and they would give the same quality of management service to those tenants in PSL, private sector leasing, that they would give to their own tenants. So it's quite a good offer compared to what we have currently with people in nightly paid accommodation where landlords are managing it themselves. So we are quite keen that we can increase the scope. It'll increase the scope of the short tenancy we can get quite significantly, we think, if we can do a good deal with Notting Hill. And although Notting Hill aren't particularly moving into the area, they already do this quite a lot across London. They haven't just been doing it in this area before, so they're keen to move into this area and do it here as well. They haven't really had a big presence in this kind of northwest area of London, northeast area of London really previously, so they're keen to merge that here. They're building a lot in the borough now. They're a major partner for us now, Notting Hill. Now they're taking over Genesis stock. They're one of our biggest 6 housing associations in the borough, so we're keen to work with them effectively if we can.
Just to let the panel know that Notting Hill will be coming to speak to you as part of your social housing project. So any questions on this area, I'm sure they'd be happy to field then.
Question from Councillor Carter. Yep, that's fine, as long as it's a question, unlike mine, of course.
I would just note that I appreciate that the development vehicle is not known by everybody in the borough, but it is an increasingly popular acronym in the borough.
Popular as a moral judgment.
Okay, so our next item is the HDV update, but I'm just, just to say we've managed to spend most of the meeting still talking about the HDV, which is not much of a surprise. On that is, unfortunately, We've got apologies from the officers who were going to provide us an update on this. It's just due to unforeseen circumstances, and I've got a brief update which I'll read out, which is. Following the judicial review hearing at the end of October, the Council is awaiting the Court's judgment. It is still the Council's intention to sign the HDV legal agreements when it is legally appropriate to do so. So I think as we haven't really got anybody present who can answer any questions on it, I think we should just accept that as an update. But if you've got any questions that do arise from that, then we can agree that we will email them to Christian, who will then put them to officers who can then be prepared to answer them at some future date. Any questions around that? Councillor Carter. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just curious about the wording when it says when, given that this is all sub judice, it says when it's legally appropriate to do so. Surely that should be more tentative. Surely it should say if it is legally appropriate to do. It's almost, I'm not saying it's contempt of court, but it just seems a little bit sloppy.
I think that's duly noted, and we'll obviously make sure that is changed. Councillor Brabazon.
Given that the report, the sentence that you've received, suggests that work is still going on, since it says when they're going to sign it, which assumes that some... What do you mean by work is still going on? Well, work hasn't stopped on the HDV. The sentence you just read out presumes that it's all going to happen. So if that is a presumption, I'd still like to know what's happening with this member agreement. I'm really not going to let go of this because I know how important this is, and I think we need to see what progress has been made in redrafting. And I'll say it again, I've said it 10 times, I'll say it 11 times.
Okay, so as I've said, what we'll do is, obviously because it was an agenda item, what we'll do is if you put that question in writing and if you forward it on to Christian. Okay.
Can I just
yeah.
Dan Hawthorne has asked me to pass on his sincere apologies. He's unwell, and that's why he's not in attendance this evening. So if you do pass me any questions, I can make sure that those are picked up with Dan, and we can look at the best way of providing answers to those questions that you've raised. But that will obviously have to be done as soon as Dan's back from being unwell.
Okay. Any further questions?
Chair, since he's not well, I'm really sorry, and I hope he's going to get better soon. Given the fact that this is such a, has been our issue for a long time, is it possible perhaps to reconvene our meeting or something like that in a week or something like that?
I think probably the best thing to do would be that's going to be quite difficult to organise, I presume, Christian. So, yeah, exactly, because we don't know, how long that will be. So, I would propose that we put those questions in writing, send them along to Christian, and obviously when we can get an answer, then we'll get that. And rather than wait, we could wait and have the item on the next month's agenda, but I just think I'm conscious that people want some questions answered as soon as possible. Us to the work programme update, which is on page 25 to 34. So, I just want to give a brief update on that. That'd be.
To be honest, there's no real updates really from the last meeting. Just following on from the last point, there is another HDV update requested for the meeting on the 19th of December as well, just to sort of let you know. Really, this is an item to let you know if there's anything else you'd like to raise or have included, bearing in mind that you do have quite a full agenda, and also with project work that will be continuing through November, December, January.
Is it a quick question? Yeah.
I think there are, Chair, I don't know how we do this, so I defer to the advice, but it seems to me there are some other regeneration issues that we haven't talked about this committee, and I don't know whether they could come onto an agenda for our next meeting. For example, as I said to you, is that possible?
Not for the next meeting. Unless we will take something off, because
okay.
The next one is the budget scrutiny meeting, and I just think we need to spend some time on that.
Right. Well, shall I tell you what are the issues that I think are really important now? Our High Road West and what's happening there. Hornsey Town Hall, which obviously is a matter of great public interest, is without shadow of doubt in my mind, because it involves housing, is a regeneration scheme of some description. And we might want to return to the community infrastructure levy, but those two issues seem to me to be really important in relation to regeneration, and we perhaps could, if officers come and do a general Q&A, Chair, that those issues could be on the list.
I'm just conscious that we've got, for our next meeting, we've got budget scrutiny, preparation for the Homelessness Reduction Act, which I think is a really important item. We've got HDV update and scrutiny work. So if we're going to take off, we could take off HDV update and add Hornsey Town Hall, but I'm not prepared to not have an item on the preparation for the Homelessness Reduction Act. Yeah. Well, no, we've got budget scrutiny, Zena. That's our big meeting of the year, which is entirely dedicated to the budget. And I'm just conscious that the one last year was quite overshadowed by the HDV again. So what I suggest is we could take, so on the 13th of March, again, we've got HDV update, housing for older people, social housing scrutiny, which is going to be that's going to be our big project. So again, the only item we could take off that would be HDV update.
You've probably got more than me.
Yeah.
Whether it's something you want to discuss, maybe the chair of OSC, for that meeting.
Yeah.
And think about how you can best look at some of those issues, given the time, or whether OSC might be able to pick something.
Okay, we could propose that OSC could pick some of the stuff up around the Hornsey Town Hall. So, yeah, that's a possibility, because it was dealt with by OSC anyway in terms of the recommendations. So we could do, shall we suggest that? Good, I think we've agreed.
So if we say that, just to be clear, that on that, if the Chair was to make that recommendation to OSC at the next meeting, which is November, and think about when they're meeting and when that could be fitted into their work programme.
I'll make
Another thing really to let the panel know is that tomorrow we've got the meeting at the GLA. Just be good if people can arrive for 12:15. We've got a presentation from officers at the GLA on the Mayor's housing strategy, and then we'll be watching the Assembly scrutinise the Mayor's housing strategy. And then Thursday this week we've got a session with 2 guests, and also we received some written information from Ipos Mori, which I think will be quite interesting if people have had a chance to look at that.
Sorry, no new items of urgent business, and dates of future meetings will be the 19th of December and the 13th of March. Okay.